morning, everyone, from wherever you are, either here at Cyprus or online in different countries and jurisdictions. It's a pleasure to welcome you for this final conference of the Shaelou module on European law governance in populist times, or EU POP. Thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to Andreas, Nicolas, Caterina, and everybody who has helped with the organization of this final conference. So this is almost the end of our 3-year journey into populism and issues related to populist trends and the rule of law, and I think it was a very nice journey. Started by our colleague Laulhe and Shaelou, who moved on since then, something quite related actually, and continued by Andreas and myself, primarily, also with Andrea Manoli for some time. So it was a great pleasure, and of course it inspired us for more work in the field of the rule of law and threats to the rule of law, but more innovative work, because of course there is a lot already on the rule of law and European values across the world. So as a result, we are now, well actually we have now started a new genre in action. It is a Center of Excellence. Good morning, Nadia. It's a Center of Excellence on the rule of law and European values, which we are very happy to present to you. And we will have, I think, occasions, Andreas, I think, to discuss it over the next few days, the next 2 days actually, particularly tomorrow with Professor Koslov's lecture, but not only. There are traces and elements of rule of law and European values in everything we do. So we welcome you to this final conference, the EU POP final conference, and we'll also welcome you to basically the start of that new project, the Laulhe Center of Excellence, which is called Laulhe, the Center for the Rule of Law and European Values, and we hope you will continue engaging with us in Laulhe for the years to come, 22, 23, 24, up to early 25. Now, we are very happy to welcome our speakers as well of today and tomorrow. And we are grateful to them because they actually participated in different manners, let's say, in the EU project. First of all, by publishing their work in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Populism, which is the journal created by the Shaelou module EU POP. And we are grateful for their time that they took to actually publish their papers with us, and we are happy that we are able to invite them today and tomorrow to basically discuss their papers that were published in the journal. We are hoping to continue the journal as much as we can, so feel free, everyone who would like to submit one paper or even to the working paper series, which we also have under EU POP. Feel free to get in touch with Andreas and myself, and hopefully we can make this going. So I don't think I need to say much about who we are, because we are in here, everybody knows each other already, whether in this room or online, so you know who we are. But I wanted to share with you a few thoughts about our websites, the EU POP websites, because I think you'll find them extremely helpful. So I'm going to basically drive you through the websites so that you understand who we are, what we do, who you are. I think we said already we have some authors from the journal, and we have some participants who are actively involved in supporting EU POP from their own institutions and from their own disciplines. So we are very happy to have all of you here. And by showing you the platforms, the 2 platforms, the platform of the Shaelou module and the platform of the journal, we will be able to basically have an overview of the preliminary final findings of the project. So if you don't mind, I will stop my sharing the screen of my presentation for a second. And take you to the website. Right, so for those of you who are not familiar with the website yet, apologies if you can't see me, I have to stay at the podium to navigate. This is the EU Pop website, so eupopulism.eu. It's a very fine website, I would say. And in addition to, of course, understanding the project itself, what we are most in and who we are. So here you have who we are. Okay, you know me and you know Andreas already. Andrea Manoli used to help us with the project as well. And as I said, Natalie is actually the person who initially started the project. And then, of course, we have had the pleasure of having very eminent guests on EU Pop in the past few years. One of them is Ulla. The other one is Andreas Ketsis from the European Parliament in Cyprus. And then our last guest is Professor Koshnov, who you will see tomorrow. Now, what I wanted to share with you, other than the news and activities platform, which basically has everything we've been doing, so it actually sends you back to the activities. We currently have the third issue of the Journal of the Interdisciplinary Journal for Populism in the making. So we are very happy about that. So the call for papers has closed, and we are working with the guest editor on that. We also have the, as you can see, the EU Pop Summer School that is forthcoming on the 10th and 11th of June 2022. It will be a hybrid format like this event. So if you could please share with your network, we would be very happy, very grateful if you could do that. We will send you information about the summer school after this final conference. But basically, we have had a number of activities across the years or over the years, including guest lectures and webinars, roundtables, and you can find everything here, including reports on those roundtables, all those guest lectures and those seminars. In addition, you can find in the media section, in addition to some of the media interviews we gave, you can find under the video section a lot of videos that actually are dedicated to EU Pop. And those videos are the ones of all the activities we have been doing across the year. So they are webinars, basically, or guest lectures, or roundtables, or podcasts. And you are very welcome to to listen to them and to share them as you wish. They are all placed on YouTube. In addition to those videos that are the main activities of the modules, if you want, we have the summer schools. So we have already had 2 summer schools, the one in 2020 and the one in 2021. So if I take, for example, 2021, and if you click on it, you will actually see the videos of all the participants to the summer school. This is great materials which you are free to take away, use in your teaching, in your knowledge transfer, in your writings, or even in other videos. We are very happy to be able to contribute to this. So please have a look, and if there is anything you think is worth sharing or promoting, let us know, or do it yourself. So basically we had the 2020 theme, 2021 theme. So the 2020 theme was more on the theories of populism. The 2021 theme was actually on judicial independence and populism. And the theme of the 2022 summer school that is forthcoming now is a wrap-up summer school of any pending issues we have identified in the course of the EU module. In addition to the summer schools, we have a long list of open access bibliography in the field of populism, the broad field of populism, which you are free to refer to and click on the links that will take you to the open access resources. In addition to that, we have a working paper series. So with one working paper, the second one and the third one and the fourth one are currently in the process of being finalized. Again, you are free to take those with you by just clicking on the PDF. And finally, the journal. So the journal takes you to another platform, which I would be very happy or grateful if you again share with your contacts. I know that our authors have done that already. So this is a platform entirely dedicated to the interdisciplinary journal of populism or populism. And the issues are published online. They are freely accessible. Everything is open access. The journal is indexed on High Online, so this is a good index for journals, not only legal journals, but interdisciplinary journals. It's a global index. And every publication we have in the EU, of course, have either an ISSN or an ISBN, so they are traceable, in other words. So, hoping you find this information and these resources useful. I was very happy, Andreas, I don't know if you have seen that in working paper number 2 by Professor Laulhe. There is extensive reference to our journal. So I was very happy to see that. This is good. This is how we create an academic community around the topic. So thank you for that, whoever is citing and using action. The resources. And I think this is more or less what I wanted to show you. So let me just again launch my screen. And it is not actually Carlotta is here, so it would actually be the right time to transit to our first session of this morning by Carlotta Rigotti. Now, this is a very interesting area. Penal populism. Some considerations arising from the possible criminalization of women-like sex robots. So that will be our first speech. And in the same session, we will have Christos Marneros, also a contributor to the journal, with a paper on against the populist resentment, published in the second issue of the journal. So, Carlotta, if you can hear me, very warm welcome from all of us. It would be great if you could switch on your camera and your mic. I will switch off mine, of course. And if you have slides, does she have slides?
She has.
Yes, I have slides.
Great. So we find your slides. Thank you, Carlotta. Or you can share yourself your slides.
I can share my slides because otherwise I have to ask you every time to move to the next slide.
Nice seeing you, Carlotta.
Nice to see you. It's nice to put faces on the name finally. Okay, I can share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Carlotta, everything is perfect.
Okay, super. So I'll just change into the presentation mode.
Yes. So
and
for the purpose of discussion, Carlotta, how much time do you think your presentation will take?
So Andreas told me that I had an hour, so I thought that my presentation would take around 30-40 minutes, and then the rest is for the question and answer session.
And Christos? The same. So they have half an hour each, basically.
Yeah, so 40 minutes each.
Oh, no, sorry, we have 2 hours for a session. No problem.
Yes.
My mistake.
Yeah, I was also surprised, but I mean, I usually speak quite quick, so maybe I even need less time. So, first of all, I thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. It was really interesting also to know a bit more about your experiences the 2 years, and I'm really sorry that in the end you like half of it was actually during the pandemic. And I'm really sorry like not to be there in presence, but I'm currently in the UK for a research stay in Durham University, so it would have been quite complicated like to fly to Cyprus. I thought I've never been there, so it would have been super exciting. So just a couple of words about me. So my name is Carlotta, and I am a PhD researcher at the Fundamental Rights Research Center of the Free University of Brussels, the Flemish-speaking one. And I'm actually about to finish my PhD, and so like today I'm gonna present some of my tentative findings. So I feel anxious and excited at the same time. So, and more generally, like my research interest lies at the intersections among law, gender, and sexuality. And in fact, in addition to my PhD, I'm also working on several research projects, also funded by the EU Commission, including on like topics like sex work, trafficking human beings for sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, and so on. But as I said, today's presentation is about parts of my PhD, and so I will actually start by providing you with a bit of context, meaning what are sex robots? Because I think that's the main question you are asking yourself. Who is suggesting to criminalize them? Why we should criminalize them? And we will actually discover that part of feminists and academia voice some moral and social concerns about the negative consequences the use of women-like sex robots might have on the user as well as on society. And in my PhD thesis, I show how these moral and social concerns can be transposed into the realm of criminal law and can actually satisfy two positive principles of criminalization. And maybe, even though you're not lawyers, you have already heard of them. Those are like the arm principle and legal moralism. And these positive principles of criminalization provide us with indication on when to use, when to deploy criminal law. But the criminalization process is a bit more complicated than that, and the fulfillment of these positive principles doesn't mean that we get the green light, we can criminalize. So we will need to take into account some negative principles of criminalization, which serve as a restriction on the use of criminal law. And in this regard, we'll talk about the ultima ratio principle, where criminal law is used as a last resort, when no less coercive measure can effectively prevent or eliminate the harmful or moral wrongdoing that concerns the legislator. But, and here it's like a big but, it's true that the legislator criminalizes any harmful or wrongdoing as a last resort. Just actually, many authors agree that we are facing a crisis of overcriminalization, where criminal liability is unnecessarily broadened or harshened, and so, in my opinion, the possible criminalization of sexually abusing women like sex robots could also prove them right. And in this context, I'll identify 4 reasons for this crisis over criminalization, including penal populism. And so the main part of my presentation will then define peanut populism, see in the context of discrimination and violence against women. And I will then critically discuss why the legislator should refrain from it, from both a gender studies and a criminal theory angle. And last but not least, I will finish my presentation with some constructive suggestions for alternative measures to peanut populism and more generally the tough on crime approach that carries with it. To be clear, and that's like a disclaimer, I'm a criminal lawyer, and from the CV, and I guess also from maybe the rest of the audience, part of the audience is not. So I will try to keep my presentation as clear and simple as possible, but please feel free to interrupt me or just ask for further clarification at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. And at the same time, since you are the specialist, I'm really looking forward to your feedback, especially with regard to the concept of penal populism and the negative consequences arising from it. But let's begin. So I'm quite sure that when you hear the word sex robots, several images come into your mind, and that's why I always love to talk about it with whoever like cross my life. And usually like people ask me whether I'm working on something similar to the movie Her, where I don't know if you have watched it, but the main characters actually enters into a romantic relationship with an AI virtual assistant. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. And actually the very idea of artificial lovebirds has a longer history than science fiction. And the majority of articles, like the few of them that deals with sex robots, begin with the myth of Pygmalion, where long story short, Pygmalion is a man in ancient Greece, and he can't find nothing good in women, and so creates his ideal partner from ivory. But because this woman-like statue is so beautiful and realistic, the man Pygmalion ends up falling in love with her and prays to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, to transform it into a real woman. And other than myth, actually we find some historical evidence of human replicas designed to stimulate sexual arousal. For instance, back in the 17th century, Spanish sailors needed help with sexual solitude and built the so-called Dame de Voyage when crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And then it also seems that during the Second World War, the Nazi government created another elementary type of what we would currently define as sexual, so that its soldiers could temporarily cope with sexual frustration, but at the same time would never replace the so-called honorable mother at home with anyone else. But what's matter now, it's what's happening today. And today we have a couple of high-tech companies that are usually located in the US and in Asia that provide some human-like machines with basic human muscle movements, synthetic voices, and other AI capabilities. And they program them to emotionally and sexually perform. And that's how we can describe contemporary sex robots. In my thesis, I also provide a legal definition, but I think there is no point to discuss about it now. What's important instead is that in describing the phenomenon of sex robotics, we can also say that sex robots are sold for private and for commercial use. So it means that there are sex robots brothels, if we want to call them like that. And it's actually interesting because, like, for instance, in South Korea, these brothels have been actually open to circumvent the criminalization of human prostitution. And as regards the shape of sex robots, of course, it can be either male and female, but as you imagine also from the title of my presentation, the demand has been mainly for women-like sex robots. Male-like sex robots barely exist. There are just like a couple of models that you can purchase, while each buyer can actually put their women-like sex robots together, choosing amongst several like appearances, several sexual tendencies, personalities, and so on. And what is said to be the problem is that the resulting trend has been the ordering of women-like sex robots that are characterized by pornographic mimicry. And this means that, for instance, big breasts, slim waist, prominent buttons are the most common characteristics that the buyer can wish and obtain, and he or she doesn't even need to think about human autonomy. And what is said to be even more problematic is that some producers are programming personalities that are specifically meant to be submissive, subject to abuse, and or to simulate rape. So they simulate resistance to the sexual advances of the user. And I think you start realizing why some people are concerned. And in fact, after the launch of sex robots on the market, and we are talking about more or less the 2010s, many questions have soon been raised about their possible benefits, but also about their possible harms to the users as well as to society. And I've mentioned a couple of them on the slides, but today it's interesting actually to focus about those authors that have opposed to the idea of the production, sale, and manufacture of women-like sex robots, because they called for a preemptive and complete prohibition on this production. And in this context, in 2015, Professor Kathleen Richardson from Montfort University, which is based in the UK, actually launched a campaign against sex robots. And so from now on, I will just like, let's say, categorize all these authors' argument as the anti-sex robot narrative. And in particular, I identified like 3 grounds on the base of which sex robots should be prohibited. So first, sex robots are designed to call upon users to treat them as though they were equals. So in other words, they are designed to deceive the user. And criminal law already addresses deception, actually, such as in the case of false advertising. And why does it criminalize it? Because it tries to influence other people's behavior and so undermines their autonomous decision-making making process. But you could actually argue that the use of sex robots doesn't interfere with the personal autonomy of the user. On the contrary, the user could actually look for a fictional human experience. I mean, that it might be possible. But from the angle of the anti-sex robots narrative, deception by the sex robots might push the user into replicating the same interactions with other human beings, thereby threatening society from a moral and social angle. And in particular, since contemporary sex robots mostly convey the sexist archetype of women, deception could induce a false belief that each woman is, for example, curvy, slim, available, submissive, and so on. So in other words, they are afraid that user expects women to look like and behave according to their emotional desires, sexual needs, and their wishes. Second ground, well, according to the anti-sex robots narrative, there is something morally wrong with using women-like sex robots because it will negatively affect the user's character and, more broadly, society. Briefly, the way we treat sex robots is said to reflect our morality, so that their habitual and repeated mistreatment is expected to shape our character in the wrong kind of way, letting us become immoral and also inhuman. And besides, it's argued that entering into a human-machine relationship designed according to the user's wishes and programmed to succeed doesn't attain anything of moral worth. And in fact, this deceptive perfection could lead the user, or like more, society in general, to avoid and or dislike other human beings, as we become more intolerant of people who are not programmed to satisfy our emotional needs and sexual desires. And last but not least, the third ground, the anti-sex robot narratives argue that the design of women-like sex robots links sexual pleasure and emotional attachment with gender subordination, oppression, violence. And they are afraid that because of this technology, women won't be seen and treated as free and equal human beings, but rather as sexual objects available for male sexual gratification. And let's say that to some extent, these arguments are really similar about what have already been said in the context of pornography and prostitution. So the anti-sex robot narratives have moral and social concerns about the deployment of these human-like technology within society. But how to move these concerns to the realm of criminal law? As I said in introduction, it's necessary to satisfy certain positive principle of criminalization, guiding the political deliberations about what kinds of conduct we should criminalize. And in my thesis, I focus on two principles, namely the harm principle and legal moralism, because they build on the very idea that criminal law should seek to protect the legal interests that the criminal conduct negatively affects. And yes, this is a sex robot. So starting from the harm principle, based on the harm principle, the state can resort to criminal law and therefore interfere with our personal liberty to prevent harm to others. And at first sight, this formulation seems quite simple, but this first appearance is far from being true, because since forever, criminal lawyers have debated about what counts, for instance, as harm, and what counts as others. For instance, are animals others? Is the environment others? And in my context, are sex robots others? And at the same time, we have to think that sex robot is still like a machine. So we're talking on harm that is quite remote. So can we still like accept it? But I think that today we are not here like to answer this question, and I will just focus on the idea that harm to sex robots is actually a form, an instance of cultural harm. And this notion has been developed by, I think she's Irish. She's called Tanya Palmer. And in her work that I cited on the slide, Rape, Pornography, Cultural Harm, and Criminalization, she defines this new notion of cultural harm as a type of harm which manifests in the normalization of attitudes and practices deemed negative. And this is based on the idea that our personality is partially shaped by our social cultural milieu. And this means that the design of women-like sex robots embedding a sexist idea of the female everlasting sexual availability and submission to men is likely to affect our idea about the world and also about the way we can and should interact with other people, thereby making gender equality become socially accepted as a routine. And on a more pragmatical or perhaps provocative, because I'm aware that my presentation is quite provocative note, it can be said that the design of women-like sex robots we have just described is not only likely to convey a wrong idea of femininity, but also to promote the commission of harm to women in the traditional sense, like sexual harassment, rape, and so on. So I already said, like, the anti-sex robots narrative argues that because of the use of women-like sex robots, discrimination and violence against women will be perpetuated. It will maybe even increase. But let's move to the second positive principle, which is legal moralism. And according to legal moralism, when someone talks about it, they usually refer to the so-called hard Devlin debate concerning the possible decriminalization of homosexuality and prostitution in the late 1950s in the UK. And in a nutshell, while Hart was a professor of jurisprudence in Oxford, built this theory on the arm principle we have just mentioned, Lord Devlin, who was instead a judge, built his theory of legal moralism on the idea that criminal law enforcement must allow society to protect itself against the dissolution of all those shared ideas on politics, moral, ethics, and so on. So in practice, this means that criminal law must target all those behaviors menacing our shared view about morality and social cohesion. So to keep it simple, let's say that legal moralism allows for the criminalization of human conduct based on moral wrongfulness. Again, clearly, there is anything close to a common interpretation of moral wrongdoings in the literature. But in my thesis, I understood the sexual abuse of women-like sex robots as a moral wrongfulness, in the sense that it fails to accommodate gender equality, which is a core moral value that our society wishes to protect and foster to address the current unbalanced relationships between women and men. So said otherwise, it's plausible to consider the sexual abuse of women-like sex robots as a public wrong, worthy of criminalization, because it's a serious violation of the respect that we owe to each other and involves the implicit denial of the moral status of women. So it seems we have two good reasons, we can say, to criminalize. But as we said in the overview of the presentation, each policymaking process in the field of criminal law should also consider the reasons why we should not criminalize. And in this case, the so-called ultima ratio principle, also known as the last resort principle, comes to rescue us. So in a nutshell, the ultima ratio principle refers to the idea that harmful and or morally wrongful conduct should be criminalized as a last resort when no less coercive measures can effectively prevent or eliminate it. So by working as a negative constraint against criminalization, the ultima ratio principle protects our personal liberty against the state intrusive power of criminal investigation and punishment. And so, as was the case with the arm principle and the concept of moral wrongfulness, legal scholars have discussed about the nature and content of the ultima ratio principle at length. But for our purposes, it's actually just interesting to note that the ultima ratio principle does not match with the current reality, where criminal law is everywhere. And as we said, criminal liability is unnecessarily broadened and harshened. And more precisely, this means that conduct is prescribed without sufficient necessity. Crimes are framed too broadly. The statute of limitations for crimes involves overly long periods. Sentence is set to hide, and so on. I mean, I'm quite sure that if everyone takes some time and thinks about it, he or she can remember of times where a problem affecting society has been just be addressed by introducing a new crime or harshening that's already existing criminal punishment. And so against this background, I wondered why. Why does the legislator love to turn to criminal law to so much? And in answering, I found four possible explanations. First, the positive obligation doctrine that was developed in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And it means more or less that the state is required to actively engage in ensuring fundamental rights and not just refraining from unlawfully interfering with them. Second, the precautionary principle, meaning and allowing the preventive intervention of criminal law in case of risk. Third, the effectiveness principle of EU law, meaning that criminalization will eventually be used in order to guarantee the effective implementation of a union policy. And last but not least, penal populism. We have finally arrived. It's actually like a topic that I had the chance to explore when publishing on the first issue of the interdisciplinary journal of populism that was previously mentioned. And to be honest, there really has been little discussion about penal populism, especially in the legal literature. And until the 2000s, penal populism was generally understood as the adoption of criminal policies for electoral advantages. Then, starting from early 2000s, Professor John Pratt from Victoria Wellington University in New Zealand started developing a more nuanced theory of what counts as penal populism. And in his writings, Professor Pratt goes beyond the understanding of penal populism as a form of political opportunism and looks at it as a new figure of criminal justice stemming from socioeconomic and political changes from the 1970s onwards. In particular, Pratt demonstrates how the neoliberal governance has increasingly worsened the current asymmetries of socioeconomic power amongst citizens and left the same disadvantaged citizens resentful of the state, which they perceive to be blind to their concerns, to their daily problem. And besides, this feeling of resentfulness toward the state has overwhelmed citizens because it has actually arisen along with, on the one hand, the perceived rise of new risks, such as migration flows, terrorism, pandemics, and on the other hand, the spread of new social media, which redefine the parameters of public debate and knowledge about crime and punishment and open a new gap between the state and the public. And so to wrap up, let's say that Professor John Pratt traces penal populism back to the declining authority of the state to demand obedience, to the increasing distrust in politics and democracy, to the rise of global insecurity, and to the new way social media channel information. But on a practical note, what's penal populism and what does it imply? So, in a few words, penal populism results in a legislative strategy meant to restore the fragile authority of the state by proving that the political establishment can still protect the citizens' interests. And at the heart of this legislative strategy lies the idea that crime is the most obvious, is the most immediate source of danger to citizens, and that the provision of security to citizens has actually been the one of the most fundamental and exclusive competence of the state over history. And so this means that when embracing penal populism, the state shifts the citizens' focus from the disillusion towards the state itself and its political establishment, of course, to potential sources of risk arising from criminality, while exaggerating and dramatizing them. And in this scenario, the criminal policy aims to increase repression and therefore satisfy the popular expectation of justice and the victims' right protections other than the offender's one. And so when looking at the literature and giving an example of penal populism, we can actually refer to the comparison between criminality and the fear of otherness that today is usually embodied in by migrants or terrorism that are said to threaten Western values, security, identities, and so on. But it's actually sometimes argued that the same considerations could also be applied to the criminal justice agenda concerning discrimination and violence against women. And indeed, there is a vast scholarship explaining how part of feminism has turned to state power to demand more protection and more criminalization. And of course, it's like a bit more complicated than that, but most recently, the hashtag #MeToo movement that I think all of you know has shown zero tolerance towards rape, sexual harassment, and other sexual conduct harmful to women, and advocate for legal reform aimed at broadening and legitimizing more it's also said as carceral measures, so like more criminalization, to keep it simple. And to me, this also sounds a bit as a perverse alliance, because if we think about it from an historical angle, feminism was originally a critical movement that contested the legal system, and in particular, the criminal justice one, seeing them as a tool that perpetuated patriarchal oppression and patriarchal domination and women's oppression. But that's just the way it goes. And the current underlying assumption is that the most effective way to protect women from harm is, first and foremost, via the criminal justice system. And when it comes to sex robotics, I think that the feminist scholarly claim for their absolute prohibition considers this criminalization process as a symbolic recognition of the importance of discrimination and violence against women by the legislator, and at the same time also an adequate positive action to address the said existing power asymmetries between women and men within society. But in my opinion, the use of penal populism to respond to sex robotics and consequently address these unbalanced power relationship between women and men within society actually ends up reinforcing rather than undermining gender inequality. And besides, it contradicts fundamental principles of criminalization. And so we can develop two criticisms, both from the angle of gender studies and from the angle of criminal law. So, starting from the former, generally, feminist scholarship stresses that criminal law reform has neither increased nor improved the reporting, recording, prosecution, and conviction of sexual offenses against women. And it stresses this difference between law in books and law in action back to the frame of criminal justice, which often reflects the gender bias and myths and results in secondary victimization and more or less, let's say that there is like a mere distrust in the judicial system. In the case of sex robotics, however, I think it's necessary to focus on the sole understanding of criminal law as a domain of social and political struggle that the anti-sex robots narrative put forward. I mean, it's not to say that legal reform alone cannot shift social preconception and attitudes. But in the Eastern case, I believe that it's legally unfeasible for the criminal law to curb asymmetries of power between women and men by means of its expressive nature only. Gender inequality is a structural problem within society, which therefore requires an integrated and comprehensive response, which encompass, for instance, economic empowerment, education, curbing gender stereotypes, and so on, both at the state and society's level. So this means that the sole understanding of sex robotics as a criminal and law enforcement issue just draws attention away from the weakening social function of the state and the inefficient use of its resources. To be clear, this doesn't mean that we should abolish criminal law. Gender-based and sexual offenses must exist. They must be criminally investigated, prosecuted, punished. But insofar, criminal responsibility is personal, and everyone has a right to an effective remedy, including appropriate reparation. But in my opinion, the criminal legislator cannot totally rely just on the expressive function of criminal law in the hope that society will change its historically unequal power relations between women and men. And this would be extremely dangerous because it risks shaking the foundation of criminal law. So we have said that the anti-sex robot narrative puts emphasis on the symbolic function the criminalization of sex robots would have. In other words, they say, like, people, the engagement into sexual activities with women-like sex robots programmed for this purpose should have no place in our society. And after all, we should also consider that such a crime would be tough to enforce. I mean, the use of women-like sex robots mostly takes place in private surroundings. So this conduct cannot be easily controlled, and its wrongfulness will seldom leave room for the determination and of guilt in the individual case. So this means that the expressiveness of criminal law far outweighs its traditional coercive function. In other words, criminal law turns into an instance of symbolic legislation, which is adopted to hopefully appease society, but delivers a different sort of censor. Traditionally, in fact, criminal law censors the wrongful conduct it targets through hard treatment, like prison sentence. And this hard treatment impinges on the dignity and the liberty of the individual and prevents their full development as a rational, autonomous, and responsible human being, as well as their participation in society. But in the case of symbolic legislation, criminal law becomes a mere mechanism for social influencing by stabilizing the mutual expectation of behavior. And in this context, the criminal law will refrain from responding to wrongdoings and attempting to achieve deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, and incapacitation, which are the most traditional and well established punishment justification. And on the contrary, it will prevently appeal to the individual sense of wrongfulness as a reason for desistance, and will treat the users as though he were a child. So it will nudge him to act in certain ways to the detriment of his dignity and liberty, and without even knowing whether there is a causal link between the deployment of sex robots and the increase of discrimination and violence against women. Because, and that's something that maybe I should have said before, but I took it for granted, there is actually no empirical research demonstrating that the users of women-like sex robots will negatively affect the user, no society. And also when we plan, we'd like to work by analogy, and we look, for instance, at empirical research on violent video games or pornography. Again, there is no final answer. There is no agreement about the consequences that this consumption, this use will have on the user. So I hope to have just quickly demonstrated that the criminal prohibition on sex robotics put forward by the anti-sex robots narrative can be seen as an instance of penal populism that should be rejected. But what's the solution? Because everyone is always super good at criticizing, but I think we should also look for some constructive suggestions. And so to me, the answer is can be found actually in the ultima ratio principles, according to which we said, but I think it's good to repeat, each wrongdoing should be criminalized as last resort when no less coercive measure can effectively prevent or eliminate it. And so in this scenario, I suggest 3 extra legal measures and potentially 1 criminal offense where the symbolic dimension is kept to a minimum. So, in brief, first, the legislator could recommend the adoption of a code of conduct addressing the moral and social concerns arising from the anti-sex robots narrative. And the adoption of a code of conduct is actually already something that the EU legislator is already doing, for instance, in the field of data protection. And secondly, as is already actually the case again with the processing of personal data, the legislator could request the manufacturer of sex robotics to perform an impact assessment, which in this instance would focus on the possible consequences of this technology will have on society. Third, considering that it's well established that technology is value-laden and can nudge our conduct, the legislator could demand the producer to follow the principle of ethic by design, meaning that the sex robot, for example, will be programmed to verbally agree to the sexual advances of its users, as well as to engage in another conduct able to positively express, or maybe more correctly, simulate positive desire, willingness, wishes, and so on. And at the same time, since the anti-sex robot narratives also argue against the stereotypical appearance and of women-like sex robots, an ethics by design approach could reproduce diverse gender identities and sexual experiences beyond the current binaries and heteronormativity. And fourth, alpha sex robotics doesn't cause any direct harm to the individual. It's still likely that it will contribute, as we said, to the social cultural milieu people build on when interacting with the real world. And due to their current design, it will still perpetuate the contemporary power asymmetries between women and men. So, and this is particularly evident in the case of women-like sex robots that don't only reproduce women in a stereotypical and sexist way, but also explicitly refuse or tacitly consent to each user's sexual advance. Because they violate our consent-based normative standards of sexual interaction. And so as a result, I thought I'm still not 100% sure. The only specific crime I could imagine is the one addressing the engagement in sexual activities with a woman-like sex robot that is specifically programmed either to refuse sexual advances or to, and not to mimic affirmative consent for the user's sexual gratification. And I will stop here. No idea how much time has passed. Thank you very much for your attention. I know that's 30, 40 minutes. I don't know how much time has passed. It was quite a challenge. And I leave the floor to any possible question, comment, feedback, and so on.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. That was very intriguing and very interesting. And you will see that in the guest lecture that will follow, or the lecture, sorry, not the guest, the lecture that will follow after lunch, you will see that a lot of what we did in that founded project, which is called ShareCap, which is now finished, is actually right on the recommendations that you gave in your last slide. So that's a very interesting comparison and the coincidence. Plus, I think I saw Katerina exactly online. Katerina may remember that when she was in the postdoc here, we worked together on the rights of robots. So it's actually very, very, so I can point you to the publications that are relevant to the rights of robots and the underlying ethics by design issues and other issues. So thank you so much. We were saying, Andreas, that I think we should go to, we think we should go to Christos' presentation first, and then keep some time at the end for a Q&A to both our speakers, if that's okay with both speakers. And with
Super.
Thank you. So Christos, the floor
Hello.
is hi. If you could switch on your camera, that would be great.
I did, I think.
I can't see you, okay.
Oh, okay, great.
Perfect.
Great.
So again, if you can try to keep it to max 40 minutes, that's perfect.
Perfect, sure.
Thank you.
Hi all. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Cyprus as I'm currently in Krakow presenting another conference. I am Christos Marneros. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Lincoln, the UK, and also I'm a visiting lecturer in legal philosophy at the Graduate School of Law in Riga, in Latvia. The paper that I'd like to present, it's very, very different, and this is the interesting part of the populist studies, I would say, that you can present a multiplicity of different issues and subjects on the issue of populism. So it's very different paper from the one very interesting paper presented by Carlotta. So my paper wants to think about and to criticize to critique, in better words, in a philosophical kind of understanding, to problematize and to also shed a light on the problem that what I identify at least as a problem of the populist discourses in general. And when I refer to populist discourses in general, I'm thinking about the different, let's say, trends in populism. So mainly right-wing populism, left-wing populist groups and ideas and all these things, which I consider to be fundamentally different, the one from the other, of course, and between them. So very different right-wing, let's say, populist movements, but also very different left-wing populist movements and ideas. But I think that all of them, they share a problematic characteristic. And this problematic characteristic is the invocation and the fetishization of the term people, or the invocation of the people. And the problem of this is, as I argue, the fact that within populist discourses, the people are elevated to a quasi-theological understanding. And to that extent, it gains a moral primacy. What is the problem with that? For me, this is what I find interesting in discussing the issue of populism. I'm not a populist expert. My main research does not focus on populism. I am working on anarchist discourses and anarchist critique, mainly of the law, anarchist political theory, anarchist philosophy, and so forth. What is relevant to my research and what I want to argue in relation to populism is a common kind of point of critique which is shared in anarchist discourses. And that point of critique is the reliance on hierarchical principles, on moral principles, on having something acting, let's say, as a ground or as the arche or the archi in Greek of something. So hence the word anarchism, which means without an arche or without a ruler. So the problem with populist discourses is that they share this reliance on an arche. And this arche is the moral primacy that they bestow upon the notion of the people. So what I do in this paper, which is, by the way, published in the second issue of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Populism, and I'm grateful for that, is that I focused on two concepts by two German thinkers of the 19th century, and Nietzsche also, very early 20th century. One is Max Stirner. It's not that famous as Nietzsche. Max Stirner was quite unique as a thinker. He has written just one full book, usually translated as The Unique and Its Property, or The Ego and Its Own. He is considered part of the egoist anarchist kind of tradition, let's say, not in the ego sense that we mean egotistical and so forth, but this is not something that I will discuss in detail in the paper. What I find interesting and relevant in Max Stirner's thought about the issue of populism and the issue of the people of populism is a notion that he coined. And that notion is the notion of the spook or the phantasm. He used that concept of the spooks in order to suggest that our way of thinking and our way of living is haunted, and they are haunted by an over-reliance to higher ideas and higher notions. So, be that the idea of a god. During the Enlightenment period, people thought that they transcended from this over-reliance to the divine. But in fact, according to Stirner, they created new grounds and new higher principles. The notion of morality, for example, or the notion of humanity. Humanity as a universal concept for Stirner is another spook, because we cannot be, as he argues, and I think he's right, we cannot suggest that easily that there is a universal understanding of what it means to be a human. So all these spooks for Stirner are problematic because they shape a particular way of thinking and way of living, and everything which tries to think differently or live differently is immediately excluded as problematic or as deviant. And as I will explain, this is something which is strengthened by this over-reliance or fetishization of the notion of the people that we find in the populist discourses. So this is the starting point, in a sense. So the notion of the people is, in a sense, another spook, as I will argue. The second part, and the second concept that I'm using here, is one by another German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm sure you're familiar with him. And that concept is the feeling or the psychological condition of ressentiment, as he names it, or resentment. But philosophically, the concept of ressentiment is used in the French, let's say. The French word is used in order to signify these Nietzschean aspects of resentment. So this concept of ressentiment includes something more rather than mere resentment. And as I suggest, populist discourses from both right and left, but for different reasons, they are in a sense dictated, and they are defined by this feeling of ressentiment. To that extent, the political demands of populism is incapable of offering an affirmative version of politics, as I will explain. Because if you are, in a sense, dictated by this feeling of ressentiment, you are, as I will explain, act always in a reactionary manner. So you don't offer an affirmative kind of alternative to what is going on and what you don't like, in a sense, about the political condition, the political situation, and so forth. So this is pretty much the summary of what I would like to discuss. But I would like to start with a problem. And the problem is the multiplicity of meanings and the multiplicity of uses of the term populism as such. So we learned, or at least in a mainstream kind of magnitude, let's say, we learned about the term populism in the last 5 or 6 years, let's say. So this is the time when the mainstream media started to use the word. Politicians started to use the term populism in order to either define themselves, to argue that, yes, we are populist, or it was used by their political enemies as something derogatory in order to accuse them of populist kind of measures or populist ideas. You know, so from that we can see that there is a problem. I mean, populism used as something positive, people, politicians, political groups, political parties, they tend to define themselves as populists sometimes in order to get the support of the common people, as they tend to say. And at the same time, we get political forces as well using the term populist in order to attack their political enemies as something which is derogatory and something which needs to be combated. However, in the academic, at least, milieu, or and also political milieu as well, the term populism has a long history. So, for example, a very influential work of Margaret Canavan back in the early 80s and late 70s, for example. She argues that the phenomenon of populism is, and I'm quoting from her, is a term which is exceptionally vague and refers in different contexts to a bewildering variety of phenomena. So we can see that there is this problem. But also the mainstream use of the term populism strengthens this problem. The fact that the mainstream media in everyday discourses, we see that the term populism was used to define very different political situations and political outcomes. So in the UK referendum that led to Brexit, for example, it was described as a hugely populist influenced result, in a sense, or the election of Donald Trump as a US president, for example. So there is a common thread between these events. The fact that Marine Le Pen qualified for the second round of the presidential elections in France back in 2017, but also some weeks ago, or the landslide victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary, the policies of the Law and Justice Party here in Poland. So all these things were defined as a populist term by mainstream media and commentators. And to be more precise, these events can be, of course, acts and can be used as examples of a manifestation of an emergence of a right-wing, if not far-right, populism. On the other hand, we have very different events also classified or described as an emergence of populist discourses. by political commentators as well, media, academics, and so forth. So some of them was the win of Syriza in Greek legislative elections in 2015, the emergence of Podemos that are now part of the coalition government in Spain, although they changed a lot since their first emergence, but still. The refusal of Latin American governments to follow the so-called Washington Consensus as to break with the American, let's say, influence, in particular in Venezuela and Bolivia. So these events has very little to very nothing to do with the previous results that I mentioned. I mean, the parties themselves. So, for example, Syriza does not share much with the parties, for example, that supported Brexit, or the personalities that supported Brexit, or with Marine Le Pen, for example, and so forth. So we can see that there is this problem, and we can, if we want to make a bit make a distinction between these two categories of political events, let's say, we could classify. I mean, it could be a bit problematic and not very, proper, let's say, classification. But at least if we want to start from something, we could classify the first category of political events as some events belonging to this right or far right populist emergence, and the second group of events as an emergence or examples of the left-wing populism. So, as I said, we have the problem of identifying or at least having a clear-cut definition of what we mean by populism, or at least by a populist political discourse. However, I would say that there is a common thread in these very different political groups or ideas, of course, discourses and all these things. And this common thread is the invocation of the people. So as Ernesto Laclau was a very prominent, if not one of the most prominent figures of left-wing populist political theory, was professor at Essex on political discourse. Laclau states, and I'm quoting, "Any definition presupposes a theoretical grid giving sense to what is defined." So in that sense, I argue that the definition of populism is not an exception to the rule. So despite this multiplicity of meanings of populism, populism as a signifier signifies this common thread of the people. And this common thread links, at least to some extent, these very different and diverse movements, parties, and political agendas. This invocation of the people, which I argue is a common thread, acts as a discursive activity. And it is a discursive activity because the populist actor, the populist commentator, when he or she invokes the name of the people, in a sense, or when he or she speaks in the name of the people, he or she conducts a discursive activity, because he or she presents themselves as someone who acts as, let's say, as the representative of this group of the people. However, we arrive at a second problem. And the second problem is that in a similar fashion to the difficulty of defining populism, we have a problem defining this notion of the people as well. And why is that? Simply because the people can mean a lot of different things. And in particular, the notion of the people indeed signifies a lot of different things within populist discourses as well. So, for example, for the xenophobic, far-right, right-wing populist, the notion of the people usually signifies the idea of the common people, the underdogs, the pure, the real or the pious, the people who are losing their benefits because the elites do not respect them. The elites, they prefer and they protect the rights of migrants. You know the narrative that is very common. These far right populist discourses. So we could say that they are the only legitimate and sovereign inhabitants of a country. So we have one definition of the notion of the people. On the other hand, of course, we have again the position of the left-wing populist discourses. So, for example, the people in these kind of discourses, they don't have the same meaning as with the far right wing populist discourses. So, for example, for Laulhe and Mouffe, Chantal Mouffe, another very prominent figure for left-wing populist discourses, professor at Westminster University. So Laulhe and Mouffe argue that the people is something to be constructed. So the people, unlike the notion of the people for right-wing populists, is not something fixed. So they are not the people of X country, the hard-working, legitimate, legal inhabitants of the country. But rather, the notion of the people is something to be constructed. And for Laulhe and Mouffe, there are 3 steps in this construction of the people. So one is the formation of an internal antagonistic frontier separating the people from power. So the people become a group, let's say, that represents or presents the underdog, or someone who stands against power or the elites. The second point is an equivalential articulation of demands, making the emergence of the people possible. What is meant by that is that we don't have, let's say, a group of people which is completely homogeneous, but rather we have what Laulhe and Mouffe call a chain of equivalence. So different groups are coming together and they have progressive demands, and they recognize that in order to be successful in gaining power, for example, or be successful in an election or whatever, or or any kind of demands, they need to form an alliance. So chain of equivalence suggests that an alliance is formed, and this alliance acts in the name of the people. So, for example, Syriza can be understood, or could be understood, at least back in the 2015, as an alliance of different kind of demands. So demands for gender equality, for example, demands for better working conditions, anti-austerity measures, demands for trying to imagine a different or an alternative, a different kind of governance or an alternative to capitalism and so forth. So all these kind of progressive demands, they are coming together and they form these groups. So it's a chain of equivalent demands that form the notion of the people. And third, Laulhe move suggests we need, in order to have these notion of the people becoming apparent, let's say, we need a political mobilization. So it is the point of the unification of these different demands. So what we have then, to summarize, is that as a group, we recognize that we stand in an opposition against the elite or the power. We identify that there are other groups that they have different demands from the demands that we have, but we are supportive of these demands, and we come together with this group. We form a unity, and by forming this unity, we are politically mobilized in order to overthrow power or to gain power and so forth, depending on what we agree to do. So, in a sense, for Laulhe move, we don't have a fixed notion of the people as we have in right-wing populist discourses, but rather the notion of the people is something which is constructed when these three preconditions are satisfied. Now, of course, this is something that immediately separates left-wing populist discourse from right-wing populist discourses and so forth. And however, as I argue, while of course I am far more sympathetic to the efforts and the politics of left-wing populist discourses, and I don't recognize them as something that needs to be defeated, like the right-wing populist groups. I think that the problem, and I argue that the problem with these left-wing populist discourses is that they still rely on higher notions, and they cannot escape this reliance on higher notions. And this reliance on higher notions, as I will argue, but also as I explained very briefly at the beginning, is something which leads to the formation of reactionary and impotent politics. So they are politics that are not sufficient enough in order to think an alternative to the situation that we live in, to the neoliberal kind of dominance and capitalist dominance. So, yet, and despite the different understanding of the term people by the multiple and the oppositional populist discourses, I would argue that this activity of doing politics by invoking the name of the people is a central problem with every kind of populist discourse. And this is because when we operate in the name of the people, populism becomes incapable of producing and giving rise to a radical mode of doing politics in an affirmative or positive way. that is able to combat the fatalistic policies of the neoliberal and capitalist elites without falling back into the trap of a narrative which is amplified by a negative and resentful and at the same time hollow anti-elitism. This is due to the fact that the populist discourses, both in the xenophobic right-wing and progressive left-wing manifestations, share the logic that the people are the underdog. Remember the first precondition in Laulhe move, the formation of an internal antagonistic frontier separating the people from power. So when they state that, immediately they suggest that this formation of the people is the underdog. Usually this is the reality. I mean, you know, the group forming the people is usually the underdog indeed. But when you shape your identity from the very beginning in a negative manner, it is very difficult to avoid creating political demands and politics, or a political stance, in particular, which is fundamentally defined by negative and resentful feelings. And this is a problem with creating a progressive kind of alternative, or radical, let's say, better term, alternative. Ultimately, this fixation and the subsequent notion of victimhood, because when you immediately create yourself as the underdog, we can talk about a notion of victimhood here, by populist discourses, results in two fundamental problems. So, first, the notion of the people receives an unprecedented position of moral superiority, as I said at the beginning, and hierarchy. It becomes a fixed idea. I mean, for right-wing populist discourses, the people is a fixed idea from the very beginning, or at least usually, or in most cases. They are the hardworking people, the legitimate inhabitants, the pure, the pious, whatever. But also for left-wing discourses like Laulhe moves, they also, even though there is no fixed identity of the people, the fact that the notion of the people emerges from these three preconditions suggests that immediately there is a fixed idea, or at least there are certain conditions that need to be met in order to have this notion of the people. So this is the first problem. Second, the prevalence of the people, because it is constructed by a coming together of agents that are defined by a combination of negativity and victimhood, since they are the underdogs, or they are, you know, it's one of their main characteristics, leads to this notion, to this Nietzschean notion of ressentiment, as I will explain, which is a state of being, or a mode of thinking, or a mode of, you know, engaging with life and engaging politically with life, which is defined by total negativity and hatred against life, as Nietzsche suggests. So to that extent, as I said, the political agenda fails to act affirmatively, but instead it only succeeds in reacting against the politics of the elite. So on the one hand, we have this hollow anti-elitist statement of far right-wing populists, which are usually in the position of power, but maybe surprisingly for few, they are considering themselves to be the underdogs, and they are, again, astonishingly successful in managing to do that, whereas this is not the case in most situations. And on the other hand, we have the left-wing populist discourses being incapable of offering a viable alternative because they overinvest in this negative feeling and victimhood notion. So now we'll move on to the explanation of the formation of these higher causes using, as I said, Max Stirner and his notion of the spook. So, starting with an example. So, speaking at party congress and criticizing his opponents, we have the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan stating the following, and I'm quoting. He says, "We are the people. Who are you?" Speaking to his political opponents, enemies, whatever. So, of course, we know that Erdogan knows that his opponents are people. They are Turks as well, Turkish citizens, legitimate citizens of the state, inhabitants of Turkey, and so forth. So this is not a matter of empirical observation. I mean, he knows that they are people. So the question is merely rhetorical. But what he achieves to do here is that he achieves to bestow upon himself and his supporters by stating that we are the people, who are you? He bestows upon himself and his supporters a moral superiority, while at the same time he manages to dehumanize his opponents by excluding them from the group of people. So it's like he says, we are the people, and I'm asking you, who are you? If you are with me, if you change your ways, for example, you will be included within this group of the people. If not, I don't recognize you as such, as people. So this moral superiority, or almost divine superiority, and divine kind of notion of the people, is something that we can also observe in one talk given by Matteo Salvini, the Lega party, far-right party in Italy, the leader of Lega, and the former deputy prime minister of Italy as well. So in another instance, when he was addressing his party members, he claimed to be the one that was putting gospels into actions. So in that talk, we have Salvini giving a rather theatrical performance, where he's basically where he acts as a self-professed messiah, swore on copies of the Italian Constitution and the Bible. So we can see how there is a notion of political theology going on here. Is mingling of politics and theology, the Constitution and the Bible together, calling his people apostles that have as their quest the mass cleaning of Italy from migrants. Now, why am I using I'm using these examples here? Because we see a double movement. We see the elevation of the notion of the people in the populist discourses to this category of an almost divine. They are apostles. They are acting on behalf of the Messiah, of the God. Their quest is a divine one. But also we see this notion of the exclusion. So the others need to be excluded because they are deviants, because they are the devils and so forth. We are the pious. At the same time, this quasi-theological position, which is quite prevalent in right-wing populist discourses, is also maybe not that clear, in not that clear fashion, but it's also it is also manifested in left-wing populist discourses. So, for example, when Chantal Mouffe was talking to an ex-prominent member of Podemos in Hijo Erejón, they stated the following: so collective wills crystallize around the conception of the common good, around the definition of public interest, and this is a very important dimension of democratic politics. So, despite the fact that we said earlier that left-wing notion of the people is not based on a fixed identity, at least as they argue, we can see here that Erejón and Mouffe talk about a conception of common good. So again, they construct their understanding of the people around this notion of the common good. So again, the people here are the ones that they have access to this common good. So they are, in a sense, those that are fighting against evil. So again, we have this exclusion and elevation of the people to something fundamentally and inherently beneficial and morally superior. Right, and this is where Stirner and his notion of the spook comes into play, because in his unique and its property, Stirner attacks these fixed ideas or foundational moral principles. So he starts his critique by criticizing this emancipatory promise of the Enlightenment, which was considered, the era of reason, the fact that humanity prevailed over theological superstitions and so forth. But he says that we haven't progressed much. In reality, the God or the divine is not extinguished, but rather is merely replaced by other phantasms or spooks, according to Stirner. So, for example, we have a mere replacement of the divine by the notion of the human. And to that extent, we haven't managed to escape these fixed ideas that haunts our modes of existing and thinking. So the phantasms are merely presented in different ways, like the notion of the law, for example, the notion of the state, the notion of the nation, the notion of the pious, the good, the moral, and so forth. And as Saul Newman rightly notes, and I'm quoting, the creation of a modern secular world is haunted by this legacy of religion. So this is what we see happening in populist discourses. So this is a problem here, that the populist discourses are significantly invested in this theological kind of discourse, with these notions of the common good, of the pious people, of the legitimate people. In Salvini's talk, this is quite evident. He's directly using, in a theatrical manner, religious examples in order to define the quest of himself and his supporters, in a sense. Now, this over-reliance, these fixed ideas, leads to the second problem. That is the problem of ressentiment and Nietzsche. So, again, I'm starting with an example, and I'll be finishing in 5 minutes, so I think I'll be on time. The problem, we have after the success of the Brexiteers in the referendum, Nigel Farage, I'm sure you know him, he was the architect of the success of Brexit, long-serving member of the European Parliament for UKIP, Eurosceptic, populist, right-wing, too far right-wing party. Then he became the leader of the Brexit Party. Now they are called the Reform Party and whatever. And I think the example of him in his last appearance in the European Parliament is the manifestation of this resentful feeling and the negative feeling which defines and characterizes populist discourses. So Farage, when he was addressing his fellow MEPs, he stated, and this is from his last appearance in the European Parliament, when I came here 17 years ago and I said I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, you are not laughing now. So even at the time of his most, let's say, important victory, he went there and he tried, in a sense, he presented his victory in a very negative way. He focused more on the ideas and the thoughts of his opponents rather than his success. So his talk is a manifestation of resentment and negativity and revenge and all these things that Nietzsche identifies as the characteristics of this condition of ressentiment. For Nietzsche, ressentiment is a prevalent condition that is so strong in its negativity that manages to engulf the very soul of every being. So for Nietzsche, this condition of ressentiment is something which is achieved by the dominance of Christian values. So he says that when the Christian values, moral values, dominated the world, they spread a disease that led to the ultimate decadence of all aspects of life and eventually to the domination of weak and feeble values. So everything was approached with this negativity, with this resentful feeling. You know, the Christians, because they were subjected to torment and persecution, when they became dominant, they acted in a vengeful manner, according to Nietzsche, against their opponents. So their politics, their way of thinking, their way of living is completely shaped in this resentful feeling. The paradox here is that the ressentiment is something which is creative in its negativity. So all the politics of ressentiment are, in a sense, created in a negative manner. And to conclude, because I don't have much time, but I'm happy to talk about it later if you have more questions about it. Because, as I said, populist discourses are constructed by the very beginning with having this negative, vengeful, resentful feeling against their opponents and the exclusion of the opponents. They are a manifestation or a very strong manifestation of this condition of ressentiment, which is, in a sense, identified by Nietzsche, in a sense. So this is the problem that I identify with populism. And to conclude, the problem is that they overemphasize this notion of the people, so they elevate the people in this moral superior position, and they also act within this concept of a negative resentful feeling. So the politics of populists are always doomed to be reactionary and hollow in a sense. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christo, and thanks to Carlotta for her initial presentation. I thought both of them were extremely fascinating in distinct ways. Right? So the first one raised a very interesting and not so well-researched topic, I would say. And the second one tried to get us to think more about the philosophical foundations of core populist concepts and populist ideas and how they might translate into public discourse, let's say. So at this stage, I'd like to thank both of our speakers for their presentations. And I'd like to open the floor for the Q&A session. If anyone either here or on Microsoft Teams, if you have a question you'd like to pose to any of the two speakers, you can either activate your microphone and speak up at this stage, or you can write in the chat. So let's see if anyone has something to say either here in the room or Microsoft Teams. I do have a few comments myself, but I'd like to reserve them until everyone else has a chance to speak, because in these events I tend to do quite a bit of talking. Not that I'm complaining, but it's still nice to give everyone else an opportunity to pitch in. Okay,
I have a computer, so you can use that.
Yes.
Ah, yes.
Okay, let's see. Okay. So thank you, Carlotta, for your very interesting topic. I am asking whether, sorry, I can hear my voice. Yeah, so maybe. Okay, sorry about that. There was an echo in the room. So I'm not sure I understood correctly the connection between the criminal aspect and populism.
I'm sorry, I can't really understand you because there is still like
Echo still. Okay, let me double check. Okay, can you hear me now?
I think it was better from your computer because like now your voice is really far away.
Now it's very far
So
away.
it's not this mic, it's the other mic.
I will come around. So can you hear me now? Okay, so my question to you was actually, it's a point of clarification that I would like from you. Your connection is between that with over criminalizing certain activities, and you're taking on this very, very interesting scope on artificial intelligence and gender. It's a way of, for populist dialogue to try and make, like, it's a way of showing you're actually doing something. Or am I taking this very? It's like showing that you're taking a policy measure that is in order to improve a certain aspect of society, but at the same time, it's causing more damage rather than good because of this over criminalization. Am I correct, or I have completely misunderstood?
No. You are. I think you are correct. You got the point. The fact is that the basic idea, the funding problem is that, I mean, gender inequality exists, but the problem cannot be solved through the adoption of like a new criminal offense that just has a symbolic function. So that just says to society, oh, the use of sex robots perpetuates the power asymmetries between women and men within society, full stop. Because in this case, the problem is much more complicated. It's deeply rooted in society. It's a social problem.
Mhm.
And so this symbolic dimension is not enough, because if you write a law, it won't change people's attitudes. And the fact is also is that in this case, this criminal offense won't be enforced. It will just be on paper, and that's all. Because as I also said in the presentation, this conduct will take place in private settings, meaning that, I mean, police and like law enforcement agents won't just knock on your door and check how you are, like whether you're using a sex robot. Will also infringe the right to privacy and private life, like more in general. So that, and of course, like in the case of sex robots, this reasoning is really like extreme, but to some extent, we also, like me, but also like other authors, see this policy strategy in other fields. Like originally I'm from Italy, and in Italy we have a problem of gender equality. We also have a problem of violence against women. Like the rate of feminicide is really high. But instead of like adopting also like socioeconomic measures, because we're also talking about that, to also just to change also the attitude like of police, that when like women report that they have been subject to violence, they just, or domestic violence, just like belittle their personal experience, we just like increase criminal punishment, and that's not the solution. So of course, like in the case of sex robot, it's really like a matter of like symbolism, but the discussion is actually a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I can also think of at least 2 or 3. I'm sure there are more areas of criminal law that we have these criminalizing, but you're actually just glossing over the problem without dealing with the social parts. Okay, thank you very much, Carlotta. Let Andreas continue.
Okay, so let me ask a question to each of you. Of course, I have multiple thoughts on both presentations. First, a question to Christos, because I've read your article, and one key thought that I had was the following. To what extent does your conclusion about the negativity of populist discourses hinges on a specific conception of politics that you're relying on? And let me explain that a little bit. So if, for example, you rely on a different conception of politics, maybe the Arendtian conception of politics, or Jacques Rancière has a specific conception of politics. If you rely on one of those conceptions of politics, then the actions that you're labeling as reactive and not politically creative are in fact quintessentially political, and kind of this Arendtian idea of archy that you mentioned, right, of beginning of something new and so forth. So that's my first thought for you, Christo. And for Carlotta, first, I understood your presentation to be divided into 2 parts. The first one hinges more on the theory of criminalization of sex robots, and I thought that was extremely interesting, and I do have some thoughts on that because I have done some research on the topic. But I'd like to ask you a question for the second part, which is the penal populism part, and that question is the following. I understand penal populism siding with feminism for certain issues, like pornography, for instance. But in that case, it might be that the siding also has a religious component, right? So we find the intersection between religious groups being against pornography, some feminists being against pornography for different reasons, of course, right? And populists kind of saying that, oh, most people are against pornography, so let's criminalize pornography because that's a way to reinforce the principles of penal populism that we've described. I'm not sure. So that's my question to you. My question to you is, what's the populist part when it comes to sex robots? Is it kind of similar or analogous to that part about pornography? So is it, oh, this is a populist thought, a populist desire because we have religious groups against sex robots, feminists against sex robots, and a big part of the population is in fact against sex robots, so let's engage in this penal populist narrative and criminalize sex robots. So that's one thought that I have for your presentation. Thanks both of you. I thought both of presentations were quite engaging. So please, if you'd like to respond to some of these thoughts, if you have your own thoughts on them.
Shall I start? Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, very interesting and actually thought-provoking comment and question. The short answer is yes. It depends on the politics that, if I got it correctly, it depends on the politics that I mean the side or my politics in a sense. The fact that I am considering these populist discourses to present this negative, resentful kind of feeling, which I also find, albeit in a very different manner, problematic in Rancière or in Arendt, although I'm far more sympathetic to Rancière's project compared to left-wing populism, for example.
Not very surprising, yes.
But again, his concept of demos, and I'm sure you are more you are the expert in a sense more than me. But again, his concept of demos, or the way that he relies on the people to a different kind of way from populists, is still problematic, because I still identify this notion of having, let's say, as a starting ground or an arche. And I know that he's critical of arche, in a sense, Rancière.
He's critical of family in that respect, yes.
Yeah, very critical. But again, especially in his what's called the paper on human rights, he still relies, and I have a piece where I am a bit critical on him, on the fact that he still relies on this notion of human rights in a sense, and to that extent to a notion of arche, albeit the fact that he is critical of this notion of arche, and this notion of demos is also something that I find quite problematic, or this reliance on a radical notion of democracy. So to that extent, I mean, I'm happy to say that my position comes from an anarchic kind of politics, in a sense, which is influenced by Nietzsche, Deleuze, and Stirner, which is a different kind of philosophical and political framework, in a sense. So this is where I come from, and while Rancière is somehow a part, or an ally to a certain extent to this tradition, this reliance on a radical concept of democracy is problematic for me, in a sense, or any kind of notion of this democracy. So this is I think what I also find perhaps not resentful or negative, but certainly problematic in Rancière. But for left-wing populism, I'm referring to left-wing populism because I can tell you that my problem with right-wing or far-right populism is quite evident from the very beginning. Yeah. There are many reasons to have issues with them. But for left-wing populism, my problem is the fact that I consider that it is incapable of combating the elite as they want to do, because of their this fetishization with the notion of the people, in a sense.
Okay, thanks very much, Christos. Carlotta?
Yes, thank you for your question. I actually have 100 possible way to answer it because it's really like stimulating. So to be sure, I'd like to clarify that I don't think that feminism and penal populism overlap. I think that penal populism can be a consequence of part of feminist claims. So it's like a legislative strategy that the state can adopt to, let's say, embrace part of their claims and so recognize that there is a problem of gender inequality within society. And it's interesting, yeah, I think there is like a link with religion. It's something that you actually, I mean, I've never found it when it comes to penal populism and feminism research, but it's actually well established when it comes, for instance, to human trafficking. When the Palermo Protocol, the UN Palermo Protocol against human trafficking for sexual exploitation was discussed, it was clear that there was an alliance between religious groups and part of feminism, what I usually call like radical feminism. So, but with regard to sex robots, I don't know whether religious organization have been involved in Europe, because that's the geographical scope of my thesis. I know that it has happened in Canada. I think it was an evangelistic church or something like that. So of course, like the moral concerns are really similar to the religious ones. And yeah, I think that, I mean, sex robots arguments are really, really similar to the pornography, the ones relating to pornography and prostitution. And you can see it because there is a website about this campaign against sex robots. And amongst the organizations that are parts of this campaign, there are feminist organizations that are against pornography, against prostitution. So it makes sense that the claims are similar and are justified on the same ground. To be honest, but I don't know whether I got it right. Of course, they say that big part of society is against, but to be honest, there is no evidence on that. It's more like holistic terms, if you pass me the term, because no one has ever like interviewed like anyone, and so it really depends on your position. And yeah, I mean, that's I hope to have answered the question.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. Yes, Nina, please.
Hello, my name is Evelina. I'm from the Donetsk University of Internal Affairs. Recently, I'm a guest at the Euclid University, and your reports were very interesting for me and gave me a push to ask you some questions. The first I would like to address to Carlotta. While I was listening to you, I reminded the lecture that we have at the University of Genoa with the Professor Guido Amaretti. We spoke about the future of our planet till the end of this century. And they did a forecast what is going to be with our planet. And he said at the beginning of our research, we thought that the planet will be yellow. But when we did our research, it was ended, we understood that planet is going to be black. Black because the African continent, they have their population will have 4 billion of people. When I listened to your essay regarding the sex robot, I have one question. Some questions. The first one: what the demographists say about these devices, let's say so. So are they going to be, what is the purpose of them, first of all? Because human nature is to make family and have children. If we want to prevent violation, maybe these robots are useful, maybe only in this case. And speaking about criminalization, I think every human activity can be criminalized. Even higher education can be criminalized if someone wants to do it. But really, what is more dangerous for humanity, for bringing up of children, for mentality of human. That's why I think that the sex robots, they will bring more harm to the mentality of human and man also, because he will lose this feeling of hunter, and we women will have more competition because we are less than male. This is the idea that provoke listening to it. So the first one, criminalization is inevitable in any case, but the another side, what demographics say about it. And another question of mine is to Christos. I also listened very attentively to your speech, and I'm from a country, Ukraine, that has become a bright example when the populist speech divided our country into different and even opposite camps, and it led to the conflict inside the country and attracted, unfortunately, a great threat to the population. So I would like to ask, is anyone politician, a political party, who thinks about the code of honors, maybe, let's say? Every politician can say everything he wants, but there are independent but dependent mass media that spread this information, that advertise this information. So to use censorship, it's not democratic, but there must be maybe a kind of code of honors, I don't know, and for the journalists and for the politicians, that some things should be restricted in order not to provoke the conflicts. Is there any new, about these codes, or it's going to be in future? Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your reports, because they really gave a ground to think and to debate. Thank you very much.
If Carlotta could offer some comments first, and then Chris can come back on this idea of censorship.
Definitely. Thank you for your questions. So starting from the purpose of sex robots, there are like two purposes. One is their commercial use. So it means that they would provide sexual services in as a commercial exchange. So more or less they would replace human prostitutes. The second purpose is for private use. So it means that they would be new companions, eventually, new sex toys. I mean, the answer is quite subjective because it really depends on how the user is or will interact with this human-like technology. And it's actually interesting because one of really like the few empirical research I found actually demonstrates that users see and treat the sex robot as a partner in their daily life. They make pictures, they have like a social media account. And so, and I link this to your comments about society is based on family and reproduction. And I think it is partially true. I think that society is more than that. And I think that we should, and the law should accept different gender identities, different roles of women and men within society, and different ways of experiencing sexuality. So as long as there is no increase of like violence and discrimination against women, and we could achieve that in other ways other than criminalization, why not? To be honest, I don't think that the use of women like sex robots or sex robots in general, because they could also, I mean, this technology could also develop in an alternative way, will like lead to human extinction. And that's also is linked to your second question. I don't think that sex robots are competitions, and I don't think that criminalization is inevitable, because I think that the state has different ways to solve social problems. And of course, criminalization is one of them, but we should also remember that criminalization is really coercive, has lots of negative consequences on the dignity and liberty of human beings. So it should really be kept to a minimum, and we should not denaturalize it by just attributing to it like a symbolic function to say we don't like this contact, full point. I think the discussion should be like more nuanced.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. Christos?
Thank you. Is it Evgenia?
Evelina.
Sorry, Evelina. Thank you for the question. Well, about censorship, it's not very easy to take a position on that, because I think the problem is engaging in binary. So if someone acts as the supporter of censorship, another party acts as the supporter of freedom of speech, and this is the trap in that case. And there is a similar trap to the populist discourses, where it is very easy to identify someone as the underdog or the elite or so forth and so forth. To that extent, I would say that personally, and my politics in a sense would not support an official, in a sense, censorship coming from an authority, be that the state, a university, or whoever is in a position of authority. At the same time, I'm not. I would not use, or I would not invoke any right to freedom of speech, and particularly nowadays, because the concept of freedom of speech, and every concept, is in a sense it incorporates certain political positions as well, and the invocation of the freedom of speech nowadays is a right-wing position, if not a far right-wing position. So I would not stand with the supporter of censorship position, neither with the position of the people who are supporters of this unlimited, let's say, freedom of speech. So what do we do in that situation? For example, Nigel Farage was coming to talk to my previous institution at Kent when I was doing my PhD. Some of the reactions were that they wanted to, to have the official university cancel the visit and so forth. But this creates a problem, and the problem is that people like Farage, they will take this opportunity, especially if they are cancelled, to present themselves as victims and become even more successful. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we have to accept these people talking nonsense, spreading racism, homophobia, and bigotry, whatever they talk about. So there are other political means to stop or to make your position known, let's say, like demonstrating or whatever, without the need, in a sense, to engage in this binary between mainstream or so-called mainstream position and them. So it is not, or at least we should not, and we should be careful to avoid taking the position of someone simply because they are the enemy of someone we don't like. Something that happens a lot nowadays, especially with the war in Ukraine, for example. We have, and I am astonished by the position of some people that I read and that I respected their work and the way they think in binaries in a very superfluous and a very dangerous, I would say, way as well. The fact that they are very, very keen on taking positions in a very superfluous and a very immature and stupid, I would say, even way. So yeah, this is my take. I don't know if that answers.
Thank you very much, Christos, for your thoughts. And with that, I think we should bring this session to a close. I'd like to again thank both Carlotta and Christos for their presentations and for their engagement in the Q&A session. And thanks everyone for joining us for this session.